Okay, let us talk nature, and hopefully Angus Kennedy is joining us on the line. Angus, are you there?
John, how you doing? Hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, very good. Glad to hear. We had a couple of technical issues, so glad to know that you're there. Anyhow, let us...
The swallows are still there. Sorry, cutting across you straight away, but the swallows are still there.
You were chatting about last week. They were doing a bit of a display on last week.
I didn't think they'd still be. I thought they might have fledged by now. It's their 21st day in this world today. Right. Normally they go somewhere between 20 and 24 days, really, and start spreading out from their nest. So, in other words, out of range of the little camera that I have in the nest. But they're in their full adult feathers now, or well, pretty much full flying feathers at least. Right. They don't have the long tail that the adults have. But they're looking smashing, and it's worth a little look. I have some videos up on the Nature Northwest page, and they're starting to explore around the area of their nest, and at one stage, every now and then, they're looking right into the camera and probably seeing their own reflection, this kind of thing, you know.
So when you say they're exploring, they're not flying yet, are they?
Not flying yet, but they're doing lots of stretching and practicing. So the last few days, they've constantly been stretching out their wings, and then they hang onto the edge of the nest, which is very precarious looking, and it looks like they're going to fall off altogether. But they flap and flap and flap, and the speed, the pace that their wings, they just turn into a blur on the camera. It's quite amazing, really. So they're getting stronger and stronger, and any day now they'll be gone and they'll be out there catching bugs.
And how does it work? The moment they fly from the nest, that's it, they don't come back. Is that how it works?
No, they'll still come back, or at least they'll come back into the shed for probably up to about a week or so. Now, it depends if people are in and out of the shed or around the garden a bit, that might scare them away. But if it was undisturbed, they'd come back for up to a week and stay there at night time. And you see, they're still dependent on mum and dad for a week or two after they fledge the nest. And mum and dad kind of teach them, train them how to catch flies above us. And you'll see that at the moment if you're looking out for swallows, and you see the swallows with their long distinctive tails, and then you see some other swallows which don't seem to have the tails. That's their chicks, and you'll see them feeding in mid-air. It's quite amazing really what they're able to do. They're able to catch the bugs in mid-air, and then they feed them to their youngsters, and that way the youngsters learn then, and within 2 weeks they're self-sufficient, and they're flying and eating and putting on as much fat as they can, because remember, in another few weeks they're trying to fly the whole way across the Sahara Desert and down towards South Africa.
Right, they would need to get a bit of grub in before that journey.
They sure do. These guys will hopefully have a good chance, because they've the rest of summer now, the rest of June, all of July and August and some of September to strengthen up, whereas there'll most likely be another nest starting in July here, and there'll be lots of them scattered all over, and they have to learn very quickly indeed, because they tend to fledge within a few short weeks before they make their massive migratory journey.
Now, there's another bird, and chicks of another bird that are getting very vocal around about now, and that is the long-eared owls. And these are, well, they're spectacular-looking birds. They're beautiful.
They are. They're beautiful-looking birds. They're our most common owl, a long-eared owl, and don't be put off by the name, because often people are looking for them and they don't see the long ears. They're not actually ears at all. They're two little feather tufts that stick up if they're alarmed, or if they're trying to display to another bird, or they're trying to frighten us away or anything else away. And they've got these big yellow eyes, these bright yellow eyes, amazing looking eyes, and then these little tufty feathers that stick up, which gives them their name.
And they make their young make a very distinctive sound.
They do, yeah. So they're more common than people think, really. If you've got mature woodlands, there's a good chance that there might be long-eared owls about. But at this time of year, and it was about 4 days ago that I heard my first one of the year, here the youngsters, they give out a little begging call, and it sounds a bit like a squeaky gate. I'll play it here now if you can. Just give me 1 second. I don't know if you can make out that little sound.
Just about, yeah.
Just about. It'd
be rather annoying over a period of time, right enough.
If it was right outside your window, it would be. But usually they tend to be a good bit away. And they're about the only, or one of the very few sounds at night at this time of year. So it's worth listening out for. Now, I must say there was song thrushes singing on Sunday night at 11 o'clock, just after 11 o'clock actually. There was 3 of them competing away with their song. But of course, that was the longest day of the year, the shortest night pretty much.
Yeah.
But these guys, the chicks are starting to spread out. They're literally, as they call it, branching out. They're heading out of the branches away from the nest, and then they start taking short flights and they spread out into woodlands, or maybe even into different stands of mature trees. And they'll call, and that call on a still night will go for up to 1 kilometre. So they could be a long way away from you.
And that is them looking to be fed, is that right?
And that's them saying, "Mum, Dad, we're hungry. Can you sort us out, please?" And you also a better chance of seeing the parents at this time of year, because of course it's so long, or the evening is so long. We have that little bit of light. The dusk just seems to go on and on and on. And if you see a bird, you won't hear it. That's the amazing thing with owls. But if you see a bird, if it has pale underneath the wings, but it's darker than the rest of it's darker, that's most likely the long-eared owl. And they're frantically hunting at the moment, trying to get enough food for their 3, maybe even 4 chicks that are calling away at the moment.
And the best time to see them would be just before it gets dark, would it? They're nocturnal.
Yeah, just before it gets... Yeah, exactly. So they later on in the year, the night is long. They hunt away there. They're stealth hunters. They'll take bats sometimes. They'll take frogs. They'll even take songbirds sometimes, pluck them right from the perches. But really what they're taking is rodents, mice and little things like that, shrews and whatnot. But this time of year, the night is so short, they have to go out when it's a little bit earlier. And, of course, they've their chicks to feed. An amazing thing, if you've ever seen a wind farm up close, if you've ever seen the blades of those turbines, or sometimes you'll come across them when they're being transported across the country, and the edges, the trailing edge of those turbine blades have notches in them. And those notches are copied. They're mimicking what owls do. The feathers of owls, the trailing edges of the flight feathers of owls have little notches as well. Barn owls are the same, our long-eared owls too. And that allows them to fly silently. So if you think of a pigeon or a crow flying overhead, if it's a nice quiet day, you'll hear them, and you'll hear them flap, flap, flapping away. Whereas the owl, it'll fly right over you and you won't hear a thing. And that's those little notches. They distribute the air in a way that doesn't allow it to create any sound. And wind farm engineers have copied that and used it in their own technology, which is just incredible, I think, really.
And where do they nest? Where do they normally make their nest?
Yeah, they'll borrow old crows' nests, typically, and mature woodlands. So they like big trees. So if there's big stands of trees, and it can be conifer trees, it doesn't have to be our native deciduous woodland, they'll go into that, to big stands of larch trees or sitka sometimes on the edges of them. And very elusive, because they're camouflaged. They're a beautiful bird, but if they're nice and tight into the trunk of a tree, they could be standing there all day with their eyes closed, those big yellow eyes closed, and you won't see them at all. You'd walk right underneath them, you wouldn't notice them. So they're masters of camouflage and cleaning up all of the little rodents that are around us.
There's a common butterfly that can be seen at the moment, and it comes all the way from Africa, the painted lady.
The painted lady, yeah. We don't think of butterflies as migrants, like the swallows we were talking about a few minutes ago, and the massive journeys that they do. But some butterflies undertake huge journeys. And the one that's probably most famous for that here, that comes to Ireland, is the painted lady butterfly. And the painted lady butterflies have started showing up in small numbers already. And they're quite incredible, really, because they start off life in the Atlas Mountains, which is in Morocco, in North Africa. And in the Atlas Mountains, there are little eggs that were laid last winter. They have turned into the caterpillars, which are eating away at thistles and whatnot, because, of course, their spring and their summer comes so much earlier in hot places like that. And then the adult butterflies eventually emerge, and they head off to Spain or France, if they can make it that far, if the weather is good, and to coincide with their thistles and wildflowers coming out in kind of late spring. And they will lay their egg. Caterpillar turns into the adult butterfly, which then starts making it up to us now.
It's all about food, really. It's all about where the most food is.
It's incredible, isn't it? It's following those seasons. Yeah, and and allowing the food to be there is such an important thing. So a lot of the smaller plants that don't flower for as long, or perhaps aren't as dramatic, and a lot of people would just call them weeds, a lot of these amazing species really rely on them. So people might look at thistles and mightn't think too much of them, or might be trying to tidy up thistles from their garden, but they'd also be the same people would be delighted to have a painted lady butterfly, this beautiful orange butterfly with black and white wingtips, and they'd love to see it arriving in the garden. And if you leave some of those thistles around the margins, around the edges, or around the field edges, or in the ditches, those butterflies will be able to feed, and they'll be able to lay their eggs. And then you'll be rewarded again, because they'll lay their eggs now, and those eggs, the caterpillars, eventually turning into a chrysalis, and by August, maybe even early September, they're turning into adults again, and they can't survive the cold, this type of butterfly.
Right.
So in August and September time, they'll be flitting around your garden before they start heading off all the way back to Africa, which is quite incredible, really, for such a tiny, delicate little creature.
Or those that don't go will be killed by the winter.
The ones that don't go won't be able to survive yet. We've a couple of butterflies that can survive the winter, but not these guys. These guys, the first frost would just kill them off completely.
A lot of them decided. To go to Cyprus last year. Was it? There was a mass migration.
There was a huge migration, and it's funny. A lot of things like that will depend very much. A lot of nature that we see, when we see nature in big numbers, it might depend on what conditions are doing elsewhere. So every now and then you get a big painted lady year. 2009 was one, and funnily enough, exactly 10 years later, 2019 was one. The normal characters started arriving late May, well, really June, late June into early July. But then come late July, there was a huge number of butterflies that kept coming and kept coming. And what was blamed for it was the heat wave that was across Europe. And a lot of the thistles that they would have been relying on weren't able to survive and had dried out. So they kept going. And the butterflies, I remember seeing them myself, all sorts of places, tops of mountains where you wouldn't expect these things to be, and all sorts of places around Donegal in late July. And they were very faded and quite battered looking. And you could tell by the way they were flying, they weren't looking for a mate. They weren't trying to hold a little territory and display and show off. They were all ready to lay their eggs. So they were immediately laying their eggs, and that was the end of that adult's life cycle. And then they were going on from there.
So the colours to look out for a painted lady: orange, red, and black.
Orange and black. Orange and black. No red on these guys.
Right.
There is, funny that you mentioned that, there is another butterfly which is a migratory butterfly as well, called the red admiral, that are around at the moment. And they are black with a red stripe down the wings. Whereas the painted lady is orange, little black and spots on it orange, but the wing tips are black and white. And that's how you'll tell them. And often when they rest with their wings open, so you'll really get a chance to see that orange. They're very beautiful things, strong flyers. They'll fly very quickly. Some butterflies kind of flit and go slowly. These guys will be bombing past.
All right, if you've got a question that you'd like me to put to Angus, then our text number is 086 60 25,000. That's for text and WhatsApp messages, or to give us a call, 074 91 25,000. And someone says, can you ask Angus to speak about bats in your attic? This is a common enough problem where bats get into the attic. So what should somebody do?
Yeah, and it's all perception to an extent, I suppose. I wouldn't call it a problem at all. I'd call it a delight. I'd love to have bats in my attic. I don't, unfortunately. Some of my neighbours do, and they're happy with them. The bats, when they go into your attic, it's the female bats that go in there, and they are going in there to have their little pups and their little babies. Bats will only have one baby per year, unlike, say, something like mice that will reproduce at an incredible rate, whereas the bats, they'll be 2 or 3 years old before they start reproducing, then just have their one a year. And there'll be a little nursery colony up there. A lot of people don't really notice them until about the middle of summer, when those young start to fly for the first time. Because, of course, they're really coming out when it's late dusk or at night time. And then the young sometimes don't find their way back in, so they might end up in your kitchen or coming into your bedroom or something like that. They're completely harmless to us. They don't do us any harm. They don't get caught in your hair. They don't try and bite you or do any of that stuff. In fact, they stay away from us and from everything else that they can. And they're catching over 3,000 bugs, each bat, each night. So the difference, and I remember a few different people in around the Rathmullen area actually telling me when they used to have bats for years, and then bats for some reason had left, and didn't come back to their respective houses, and they noticed the increase in bugs. Now, that's anecdotal, and you'd need to kind of be scientific about that, but it does make sense, because if you have a colony of 100 bats up there, and they're eating 3,000 bugs each, that's an awful lot of midges and mosquitoes and all the other characters that they're gobbling up from around your garden.
But if the notion of having bats in the house, is appalling to you, then how, without harming them, how could you get rid of them? Or do you just wait until they go and then try and seal up wherever they got in?
You have to wait. You have to wait, absolutely, because they're protected by the law, and they need to be protected for a good reason. They're protected because there are a lot of bat species. The numbers are really struggling for a variety of reasons. But what you can do is you can get bat boxes made, or you can buy some. If you look in some of the local papers, you'll see ads for things like bat boxes, and quite often some farmers will make them because they'll be using them as part of some of the environmental schemes. And the farmers get the benefit of them. It's a natural pest control that's there. So if you can put a bat box up on the south-facing side of your house or south-facing side of trees, they're a terribly simple thing to make. I have some plans actually up on the website if anybody wants to try and make their own. They're an easy thing to do. And if you put them up near where you think the bats are going in and out, and then next year they will hopefully start to use that, because they'll use the easiest point of entrance.
Okay.
But if they're in your attic right now, don't be alarmed. They're not chewing the wires, they're not eating the insulation, they're not going to do any damage like that.
They make a wee bit of a mess, though, don't they?
They might leave a bit of a mess, all right, yeah. But even that will be small. The mess that they make is small, because they're tiny, tiny little creatures, and they tend to huddle together, so they won't take up the whole attic space. So if you can identify where they are, if you can see them in the attic, quite often they go behind a little bit of lining or whatever, and just drop down a couple of sheets of newspaper. And remember, in another few weeks, they'll be gone. Like the painted lady butterfly, they'll be gone, and we won't hear from them or see them again until next spring.
And if they found a way in, they'll know how to get their way out, so it's not like they're trapped.
Yeah, they will. And some people think, well, I'll just block up the hole and that'll sort out that. Well, that's illegal. So you're going against the law. But also, what you're doing is you're entombing those bats. So those bats, first of all, will suffer a slower death, and then you're going to have that colony of bats that's up inside your attic. And even if you thought it would be a nice idea to do that at night time and you get away with that, they're not all coming out all at the same time, and a lot of the young will still be there and whatnot. So really the best thing is leave them alone. They'll do you no harm, and they'll be gone in a few weeks' time. But they'll have eaten an awful lot of bugs for you.
Mick asks by text, when do swallows leave to fly back to Africa?
So the swallows will head off in September time. And last year I had a swallow's nest being built in the shed in about the middle of July. They started laying their eggs, so the chicks didn't really emerge until August. So they're unlike a lot of the smaller birds. They'll keep breeding. They'll quite often have 2 broods. Occasionally in Ireland they'll even have 3 broods, and those chicks will hopefully come out early enough in early September or so, and then suddenly, where it's a change of temperature or a change of light or a bit of both, I just don't know, but suddenly the hormones switch inside the little swallows and breeding is over, and rivalry between all the couples and the various males is over, and they all start to flock together. And you'll see them around about mid-September time lining up on the wires, bigger and bigger and bigger numbers, and it can make quite an amazing spectacle actually, especially on a still evening or a still day where the bugs are quite low, and you'll get huge numbers of swallows swooping around, and suddenly you'll look up the next day, they'll all be gone.
Someone says we have a bird in our garden. It has 5 or 6 different tones or songs. What bird would it be? I usually hear it more in the evening.
My guess, and it's only a guess from that, would be the song thrush. The song thrush has an amazing repertoire. One of the reasons that the song thrush is written about so often in poetry and whatnot is because of the incredible amount of different notes it does. Each song, each little embellishment, I suppose, is quite short. It might only be 2 notes or 3 notes or 4 notes. But the way to know it is that if you listen for a couple of minutes, it'll start repeating what it says. So all the little notes that it does, it'll repeat 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and then it'll come up with another little flourish of notes, which it'll repeat, and another. And yes, evening time is the time for them. And as I was saying a little earlier, I heard 3 of them after 11 o'clock, just after 11 o'clock at night the other night, all singing away. And that's 3 different males competing, telling each other that this is their territory.
Right. Okay, let's move from
well be what they're here.
Let's move from birds to plants and to chat about an invasive plant species, the Himalayan Balsam. And this was actually introduced by the Victorians to Ireland.
It was, yeah, and we've a lot of different invasive species. And if you look up invasivespecieSireland.ie, you can find out more about these and about different ways of monitoring them. And there's a difference between a non-native species, which is something brought from somewhere else and planted, and we can look very nice. A lot of the things in our gardens are non-native, and invasive. Invasive is something that tends to take over, but it takes over at the detriment of local of native plants.
Yeah.
So the Himalayan Balsam is one of those, and if it takes over and, for instance, outcompetes the local thistles that the painted lady has come all the way up in its stage journey from Morocco to find, and all it comes across is Himalayan Balsam, that's not so good. It's a nice one to highlight at this time of year, because it's very obvious, it's easy to identify, and it's also very easy to control on local little patches. Any of us can control it. Some of the others, they require more aggressive kind of treatments, whereas Himalayan Balsam, you can just pull it out by hand yourself. Pull it out very easily.
And how do we identify it? It's got quite a nice looking flower, hasn't it?
It's a beautiful looking flower, and it was planted like a lot of these things, like the rhododendron ponticum as well, with its big pink flowers. Himalayan Balsam has quite a largish pink flower, which the under petal forms like a big lip underneath. Bees do like it. So it was planted mistakenly by beekeepers up until reasonably recently, but now they don't do that because it's a very irresponsible thing to do. If you're planting that, you're not helping the environment at all. And of course, these things were brought in by the Victorians because they succeeded. They took over very well. They gave lots of nice colour and, in some cases, lots of nice cover. It's our tallest annual flower. So it only lives for the 1 year. Its seeds, of course, survive for the winter. So it can grow. It can grow up to 1.5 metres, and has that little pink flower, that big kind of roundy pink flower with the big lip underneath. When that flower turns into seeds, those seed pods, which will be coming out quite soon, actually, they can shoot their seeds up to about 7 metres away, and each plant produces up to 800 different seeds. So if you see a tall plant with those pink flowers, and it has long, slender leaves up to 15 centimetres long, and they're finely serrated at the edge, and a kind of reddish stem, you know you've got Himalayan Balsam. And give it a little tug, put your hand on it, and it will come up really easily with hardly any effort at all. They're barely in the ground, very shallow roots. And damp places, rivers, ditches and whatnot is where you'll find it and where it'll spread. So
it spreads very easily, and then it outcompetes our native plants for space and for nutrients and things like that.
That's the problem, yes. So it outcompetes, so it's a vigorous grower. It doesn't have any natural biological control. In other words, there isn't any kind of bugs and things here that'll eat it and keep it in check. So it tends to take over the place. But then another problem it creates, because it's annual and because it likes damp places, so it'll often spread along the edges of rivers. You'll find it rivers all over Ireland, all over Donegal, in patches, spreading. But because it dies off in the winter time, well then its roots aren't there, of course, so it's not able to help hold the riverbank together. And one of the really important things for healthy rivers is to have healthy riverside vegetation, because it acts as both a filter, but also it acts as a way of holding the bank together and making the riverbank stronger for when it floods. And Himalayan Balsam kills off the plants that do that, and then dies off itself. So it's of no use to us in the winter, and no use to us in the summer by dominating those native species.
Another invasive species, Japanese knotweed. Someone says, how to get rid of it? It's in their garden.
Japanese knotweed is a tougher beast again, unfortunately, and its roots do tend to spread underneath the ground, and some form of biological control is needed for that. I tell you, there are some people who have done a lot of work on various controls that aren't so chemical filled, because typically people would use glyphosate, which is a nasty component, to try and control Japanese knotweed. But if you look at the Inishowen Rivers Trust website, and the Inishowen Rivers Trust have done a lot of work on this, and they've done a lot of work on trying to control all sorts of different invasive species. They also have a way of recording invasive species for the whole of Inishowen. So if you're in that part of the county, look up inishowenriverstrust.ie. Great information on how to control these things, but also you can go in and you can fill out the very simple little form which will map it, and they will hopefully, as time goes on, then be able to start looking at areas that are mapped and do something about it.
Okay, well, we've run out of time. We had loads more questions that we didn't get to. My apologies if we didn't get to your question. Maybe we'll hold on to them and address them first next week. But in the meantime, Angus, thanks a million for joining us, and we'll chat at the same time next week, hopefully.